I have been working in the field of climate change for over 25 years. It's now close to 30 years, another year or two. I've been doing that through the world of the physical sciences and chemistry as well, and looking at how we are changing the world. And the way that a scientist looks at that is either you go out and you do observations of the world, or you sit in your office, hopefully it's an office that has a window, and you build computer models of the world. And these models have been around now for 30 or 40 years. They're extremely complex. With each generation, they get more complex and they incorporate more and more aspects of the Earth system. And that's really what I've been doing, is working on the science of simulating Earth in all of its complexity. And over the last 5 years or so, as we've used these models to look at where the Earth is going in terms of its climate and where it's been in the past, I've become more and more disturbed by what I've been seeing. And to the point where I started to ask myself a set of questions. The basic one is, why are we doing this to the Earth? Why are we treating our home in this way? And if the predictions are at all accurate, and I think they're pretty darn accurate, where we're heading, we are, as a society, as a global society, going to experience some of the greatest changes that civilization has seen in its history. And I'll give you a quantitative measure of that in a few minutes. So this really is a question that transcends the physical sciences. It's really about humanity's behavior towards nature, which I view as a basic question around values. How do we value? What determines our valuing? And how do our values translate into actions? There's this dissonance between our values and the actions that we carry out in the world. And then beyond the philosophical question of the ethical question of valuing, why do we value the way we do? Which I feel is fundamentally a psychological question. It's sociological and psychological. And if you look at the field as a whole, there's been a tremendous amount of work done by social psychologists trying to determine what our value systems are. But there's been a smaller community, not so much academic psychologists, but mainly psychotherapists who work with pathology, who work with character structure, who work with the dissonance between an individual's world and the world that they're trying to live in, who ask questions like, well, I know that I shouldn't do this, but I always end up doing this, and I don't understand why I behave this way. Those are the questions that psychotherapists work with every day. Why do I behave this way? I don't want to behave this way, but I do this, and I don't want to do this. I think that's a question that's relevant to why we're treating the world the way we are, why we treat nature the way we do. And for a certain branch of psychotherapy, this involves the unconscious, that we're not conscious of every act that we perform, that there is a large part of our world, our lived world, which is unconscious. And so to what extent does that, our understanding of that, help in answering those questions that I've just posed? That's where I'm at in this process. So I started from the physical sciences, seeing signatures in the observations, seeing predictions from models that are very disturbing, and beginning to ask questions. and realizing that I didn't have the tools to answer those questions. And these are questions that many of you in this room have asked through your careers and have written papers and books on. And then the personal interest that I have in psychology, in particular depth psychology, and to what extent that discipline can help us in this problem. And then there's a final piece to this. We could all sit in our rooms, and we can sit in rooms like this and collectively talk about this and discuss it. But how do we get what we've discovered out to the people? And in a way that people are going to understand what we're talking about. I think this has been a tremendous barrier in the sciences, is that scientists work in a world, they use a language that they're very familiar with and very comfortable with, but it's been very difficult to get their message out to people. It's been very difficult to bring awareness out to the greater community around these issues. And that is where image, I think, is involved, and that is where story is involved. And so there is another dimension represented here, which is people who work on conveying messages to the greater world, either through journalism, film, writing. And so the final piece to this is, what if we come up with solutions? What if we are aware of the severity of the problems? How do we get that message to a greater collective group of people? Most of us are challenged in that way, I think. We tend to work in our own thought world, and we can write articles and books for our colleagues, but to go beyond that realm, out into the world that most people live in, that are determining a set of values that affect the climate system, that's difficult. And so we need the help of those who work in the world of images, who work in the world of story, who work in the world of media. And that's why we've asked some of the people that are involved in that discipline to be here. So what do I mean by nature visible and invisible? Well, there are a lot of ways you can look at this. I think of the visible signs of changing nature are, as I said, we've got scientific observations. We can build computer models to simulate the climate. And then there's personal experience. And I want to keep coming back to personal experience. I think this is something that's very important for our interaction with the world. And then I feel strongly that there's also times where the world becomes invisible to us. There's loss of a lived world. And by the way, the two themes that you're going to be seeing, you will see woven through this talk, are the fields of phenomenology and the fields of Jungian psychology. So loss of lived world certainly falls within the domain of phenomenology, and I'll talk a little bit of how I think the world becomes invisible in a phenomenological sense to us. And then I think there's an interiority both within ourselves and within nature which remains invisible. And that goes out into the dimensions of the spiritual domain and the religious domain. So some hard science. Steve Bennett, don't fall asleep. It's a graph. This is an interesting graph. It was put together by a colleague of mine who's at Duke. This is a record of the global surface temperature over the last 100 million years of Earth. And time goes from the past to the present here. This is 100 million years ago, and this is the present. And you can deduce this very cleverly, this temperature, from looking at oxygen isotopes. And I'm not going to go into the science of that, but it's a very accurate measure of using geologic data from oxygen isotopes to determine what our Earth's temperature has been through this time period. You could see that 100 million years ago, the planet was much warmer than it is today. We're down here, okay? So it was about 15 degrees warmer 100 million years ago globally than today. And that what we've been doing over geologic time is cooling off, okay? Slowly cooling off over 100 million years. Now these blue bars here are the projections of where we're going to be within the next 80 years, okay? Depending on how sensitive we think the climate system is. And best estimates now are somewhere in here, these two blue bars. So what this is telling us is that within the next generation, and certainly our grandchildren's generation, Earth will be as warm as it was 50 million years ago. That was a very different world. We have lots of geologic data to tell us what kind of world that was, and it's certainly not the world that we're living in now. Okay? This is where we're headed. And it's not happening on 50 million year time scale. It's happening in a generation or two. So I claim this is going to present a tremendous problem for society. Psychological, sociological, whatever, economical, whatever discipline you want to choose, this is a real challenge. Not only that, another graph, Steve. Not only that, we have already committed ourselves to change because Earth holds memory. And that memory is mainly held in the oceans. This is a what-if experiment. Models are great. You can create your own what-if scenarios. This is what if today we could just freeze the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and not allow it to rise anymore. Magically make it stop increasing. And what happens is that the temperature, the globe does warm, but it doesn't warm that much. It just warms up a little bit. But the problem is sea level goes up, keeps going up into the next century or 2 centuries. Why? Because we have been putting heat into the oceans for the last 200 years due to burning fossil fuels. And that heat is going into the oceans, and the oceans is storing that heat, and it's going to remember that we've warmed it up for the last 200 years. And the memory of nature goes on for a very long time. If you can't grasp this, then let me just provide a thought experiment. Put a pot of water on a stove, heat it up to boiling, turn the heat off. How many of you would stick your hand in that pot of water? Because the water remembers that you've been heating it for the last 30 minutes or so. And it's going to stay warm for a while. And that's exactly what the oceans are doing, is that they've been warming up, the heat's going down. As you heat water, it expands, and sea level rises. So, we've already committed ourselves to climate change, a significant climate change, even if we were to somehow magically stop our use of fossil fuels. Those are the visible signs in both observations and models. These are the visible signs that we're seeing in personal experience. We know what happened in New Orleans last year in Katrina. We know that sea levels are rising, especially felt in the Pacific, where atolls are less than a foot above sea level, so that surges are basically swallowing up atolls, and the melt of permafrost in Alaska. This is a cemetery that's essentially collapsing because the permafrost has started to melt in Alaska. So these are personal visible signs. You can go talk to people and they'll tell you something's strange with the weather, something's strange with the climate. Those are the visible signs. This is just an indication of where we're going. These are estimates of energy demand. This is what people say they need. Society says it needs. These are global demands. We're about here. You don't have to really know the units, but essentially the curve continues to go up. This is just over the next 20 years or so. tremendous increase in global demand of energy. And this just tells you that it's not just the developed world. In fact, the developed world in not too distant future, this is about 2020 or so, about 14 years from now, the demand, the production of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere by developing countries is going to strip that of the developed countries. So India and China are going to come into the fore. Those people want the lifestyle that we have, and they're going to demand a tremendous amount of resource. So this is a global problem. It's not just confined to this country, although I think it's incumbent upon the developed countries to set a standard for the world that they can, an example, which certainly this country is not doing a very good job of. So people can ignore the facts. They don't cease to exist because they are ignored. This is one of the problems, is that people either don't want to hear these facts that I've just told you about. They want to ignore them and feel that if they ignore them, the problem goes away. It's the ostrich approach to dealing with a problem. Facts are great, and I've spent close to 30 years of my life working with facts. But I think the problem is there's something beyond facts. And the problem is that people in general have trouble listening to endless talks on facts, looking at endless plots of temperature and bar charts and whatnot. And so what we really need to do is go beyond facts and what Sartre is talking about here, essences. And this is where we get into questions of valuing. We know in this country that a significant amount of our carbon dioxide in the atmosphere comes from three things. One, the size of the homes we build. We like to build big homes that require lots of heat and air conditioning. Two, the distance we have to drive to work. And we like to sit in gridlock on highways and burn up fossil fuels. Three, the size of the vehicles we buy and drive, which are three major contributors, the other being the source of fuel that we choose to use. Fossil fuels, coal and oil, are cheap, relatively cheap. They're getting more and more expensive, which I think is a good thing. But they're very cheap ways of meeting our demands of energy. So you put all of these together and you end up with those plots that I just showed you. Now, the question is, do we make a choice here? Do we have a choice between this and preserving this? This is a satellite picture, one of the latest satellite pictures of Earth. And that's why I think we're here. At least that's why I'm here. I want to explore these questions of what are the choices that we have and how can we affect change, not just within our own psyches, but the psyches of others, in time, to prevent us from going into a climate that we haven't seen in 50 million years. So the questions that have been arising in my mind are, why do we treat nature as we do? I think some of this is because nature becomes invisible to us and we don't consciously think about nature. What do we lose when nature becomes invisible? And what is the connection between our values and our actions towards nature? I've just come up with some ways that I see nature as visible and invisible. There's an interesting physical one in that I've just shown you a picture of the coal plant that we burn to light these, make these lights work here and our computers work. But the agent that's causing all of this problem is invisible to the eye. We can't smell it, we can't taste it, we can't see it, and that's carbon dioxide. We can sense the warming of the planet, which is very visible to us, but we can't see to the visible eye the greenhouse effect that actually creates the warming. Now we actually can see this if we go outside the visible wavelengths. You could build instruments to see the greenhouse effect, but to the visible eye, we can't see it. And I think this is one of the problems. You go out to talk to the people in the street, Global warming. Well, I can't see anything. I can, yeah, it's warmer, but what's the greenhouse effect? I don't know what that is. I can't see it. So there's a lack of imagination, and that's something that I want to bring through my talk is imagination. I think we need to start imagining what it's like living in a world that has a climate of 50 million years ago. We need to start imagine what it's like if the temperatures in my hometown, are 100 degrees Fahrenheit every July and August. What's it like? You need to imagine what that's like. Then the next four are these tie very closely to phenomenology. There's lived space, local region versus a remote region. Why should I care about the polar bear? I don't live in the Arctic. I've never seen a polar bear. Who cares if it goes extinct? I don't live there. The present and the future. So caught up in my present world, my present time, that I can't imagine future time. I can't imagine where this planet's going in the future. So a lack of lived time. Embodiment. That we have become so disembodied, and our bodies are so fundamentally connected to nature that in terms of lived body, we've become disconnected, dismembered, and we are no longer visibly in touch with nature. And then lived relationship, disconnected from each other. We have tons of distractions to keep us disconnected from each other. This thing here, checking our email while we're sitting in meetings. Disconnected, so that's lived relationship. And then on a more deeper level, I think memory. As I told you, nature has a memory. North America is still rebounding from the ice sheet that was there 20,000 years ago in Wisconsin. It's still rebounding. That's 20,000 years memory of Earth. So to what extent are we forgetting our connection to nature? And then I think beneath all of this is this distinction between conscious and unconscious. So what can psychology offer here? Well, on an individual level, psychology can look at things like character structures, personality traits, typology. Trying to understand those on the individual level tells us something about how a person's going to behave. On a social level, on a collective level, we can look more at our instinctual drives, the archetypal images that pervade our behaviors, and hopefully by looking at those and reflecting on those, we can begin to understand this disconnect between values and behavior. But this is the visible picture. There's always something underneath the visible picture. There's dismemberment that's occurring in our lives on the individual level and the collective level. And there's even things that entice us to power and desire. And so to look beneath the visible and delve into the invisible, I think, is the key to looking at this problem. So this is just a chart of how I see things working. We have visible changes in nature that are caused by humans. Those changes are based in values. They can be exterior or interior values. We would hope that these values determine our behavior, which then can cause us to change our behavior. So if I were to tell people bad things are going to happen in the future, if we keep living the way we do, consciously we would think that that could change people's behavior. Unfortunately, we're not seeing much change in people's behavior. So what determines values? This is not complete. Instincts determine values, our needs, our desires, social pressures, complexes. These are our buttons. Everybody has buttons. If you say you don't have a button, I bet you have a button. You have a button about not having buttons. And then archetypes. There's what one would hope is that through conscious reflection, all of these things, you could assess decisions that you need to make about personal issues or collective issues, like what's the source of our energy? Do we really want to use fossil fuel, even though it's cheap? Should we use fossil fuel? One should be able to assess the impacts and on all of these factors and then come up with a behavior. Unfortunately, that's not how it works. A lot of times what happens is our values fade away and we're driven through instinctual desires, needs, social pressures that determine what our desires are. Hey, you really have to buy this certain sort of car, because if you don't, you won't feel good. So if you want to raise your self-esteem, buy a Hummer, and then you'll feel good. This is more of a more primitive set of behaviors. You can also work from these complexes and archetypes affecting society, and behaviors can arise from that. Again, if you're not conscious of what you're doing, your values fade away. So what I'm proposing is that to change a conscious perspective, it's going to require us to opening up to imagining other ways, other purposes, other perspectives, which requires us to put ourselves in a relative position in the world. We're no longer the narcissistic center of the world. We have to recognize that we're in a relative position in the world. And that requires connecting to other ways of knowing. Science is great in terms of using analytic skills and thinking to come up with the facts. But what's missing is the feeling and intuition that connect us to nature on a deeper level, I think, and in turn affect our values. So how do we do this? How do we explore these worlds, the visible and the invisible world? Well, in the outer world, I think what we do is we reflect on those four existentials that I talked about when we were looking at the visible world. How are we experiencing space, time, and body and relationship in terms of nature, in terms of ourselves? To the extent that we reflect on this and look deeply at those four issues, I think it develops a connectedness not only with ourselves and others, but also nature. And then there's a phenomenology of the inner world, and you're going to hear more about this, I think, on Thursday. And that is looking at what's going on in the unconscious through dreams, synchronicities, somatically, and in narrative, our own personal story. I think that's something that's been missing in this problem, is that we need to talk more about our personal stories. And I would encourage those of you who are here at the workshop the organizers really want to hear how you got to be here. Was there something that bothered you or some question that arose within you about this issue of the environment that led you to be sitting in this room, to led you to be doing what you're doing with regards to the environment? So on a deeper level, these things manifest themselves on a collective level through myth and religion and belief systems. This is something that also has been, I think, left out of the picture in large extent in discussing why we behave the way we do to nature, is this side of the picture. And then on a more personal one, as I said, the narrative. And that hopefully by reflecting on these, we can develop a deeper sense of wholeness and interconnectedness, not only with ourselves and other people, but also nature. I'll just give you an example of this. I've written by the way, I have a paper on this. I'm just about finished with it, and I'd be happy to send it to anybody that wants it. I'm going to send it for publication somewhere. But it has develops some of these ideas more deeply. As I was writing my paper, I found all these words appearing in my paper. Disconnected, disembodied, dissonance, displaced, diseased, distant, dispossessed. disappear, all with dis. And I thought, well, what's this dis? This dis keeps coming into my writing. So dis, it turns out, if you look up dis is another word for Hades, the king or ruler of the underworld. This is Dali's painting of dis. And so here we're going to use the imagination. Imagine an environmentalist sitting in a room with the CEO of ExxonMobil, trying to convince this person that they should change the way that their company is running and what they're producing. What's going to enter the room? Discord, dissonance. These are people that are not going to get along very well. They're going to feel disconnected. Dis, or Hades, is mythologically known to have owned a helmet that when he put it on, he became invisible, and he would enter rooms invisible. So you can imagine two people in a room trying to reach some sort of consensus, and Dis enters the room. And before they know it, they're so polarized within their own worlds that they're not going to agree on anything. So to what extent can we, in our dialogues, become aware that dis is always present? And dis can always come into our discussions, and derail them from what we would like to accomplish. This is what I'm talking about, is psychological reflection and awareness of what can happen between two people. Now, many psychologies you can look at this in many different ways. This is more of an imaginal way of looking at what's happening between two people. Now, Dante, of course, wrote about dis, and I think it's very interesting what he had to say about the city of Dis. It was reserved for intellectual sins. Boy, are we all going to end up in Dis? And there were 3 rounds of Dis, 3 circles. The first was for violence against others. The second, violence against self. And the third, violence against nature. And what was the punishment for those who performed violence against nature in the visible, lived world? They were left naked on burning sand with fire raining down from unnatural clouds. Now, if that's not a picture of global warming, I don't know what is. So here is an imaginal journey into the result of what happens when dis enters our lives, when separation enters our lives. Now I want to ask you something. Think back when I was showing you the picture, the slides of global temperature, ocean sea level rise. How connected did you feel to that? Compared to how connected you feel to this story I just told you about dis. Okay? Think about it. Don't think about it. Feel about it. How did you feel when you were looking at those plots? How do you feel now, hearing the story of dis? You feel more connected? Aware of what's going on? That's what I think is missing in our story of global warming. How do we go beyond that? This is a quote from Linda Hogan. Without deep reflection, we have taken on the story of endings, assumed the story of extinction. We are already believing the story that it's over. We've committed ourselves. There's nothing we can do. But we need new stories, a new narrative that would imagine another way, to learn the infinite mystery and movement at work in the world. Okay? That's what I'm saying we need. It's not me, it's a lot of people. But it seems to be what's missing in conveying the hard facts, moving those facts to essences about the problem that we're all facing, we can't ignore, and we need to move into in the future. And if we don't, then I think we will manifest these assumed stories of endings. And that's the end of my talk.